Welcome back, everyone. I'm Zach Seward, co-founder and CEO of Quartz. And welcome to today's Make Business Better episode, which is a conversation with Google's head of product inclusion, Annie Jean-Baptiste. Every Tuesday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, I meet here on LinkedIn to talk with business leaders who are committed to making business better in their own lives and willing to come on and share practical advice to apply that we can all apply in our own lives and jobs. In today's episodes, we're going to be talking about designing technology in more inclusive ways. I'm really excited about this one. It matches a lot of my own personal interests, and it's relevant to anybody who makes products that other people use, which is basically all of us. In the next 15 minutes, we're going to give you the Quartz essentials on the basic principles of product inclusion, insight from someone who lives this topic every day, which of course is Annie, who will join us shortly, and practical tips for ensuring that your own products and product development processes are inclusive of users from all backgrounds. So thanks for joining us. Let's start with the Quartz essentials, which today I am borrowing directly from our guest. Product inclusion, at least as a term, is relatively new, and folks like Annie in roles at companies like Google have really helped to define it. These are her own 4 principles for product inclusion, beginning with there is no they, there is only we. A sense of empathy is necessary to build products in an inclusive fashion. Holistic is magic. We are not defined by any single aspect of us, and users are comprised of a whole mix of factors that need to be taken into consideration. Diversity is the core of innovation. By focusing on making your products more inclusive for one group, you're likely also making the product better for all of your users. And product and people are not mutually exclusive, which really honestly is a theme for this whole show and a lot of Quartz's own coverage, that it is in fact possible to do well and do good at the same time. And we'll talk to Annie about all of that right now as she joins us for today's show. Annie Jean-Baptiste is the head of product inclusion at Google. You're responsible for working with Google product teams and senior leaders on the creation and execution of their inclusive design strategy. She formerly created programs related to diversity, talent management, and career development within several technical product areas at Google, and is also the author of Building for Everyone, a book that outlines best practices for inclusion in product design. So I'm sure we'll only touch the tip of the iceberg in the 15 minutes we've got. For those of you who want to dive in deeper, I'd highly recommend picking up that book. Annie, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. Well, before we start, so many of us are working from home these days. I like that it kind of gives us an insight into our personal lives while at work. I understand you're in the Boston area right now. Is there anything in your space where you are that you'd love to share with the audience for a moment?
Yeah, well, I'm in a pretty empty room right now, but I do have some really cool jewelry from some Black-owned businesses. Since it's Black History Month, I think it's important to highlight them. So I have 2 rings. You can see them. They're from Johnny Nelson Jewelry and Peace Love Images. So I like having and supporting underrepresented businesses. And I think that that's just an actionable way to kind of practice what we preach.
Cool. Well, thank you for sharing that. Maybe we can get the links to both of those jewelers in the comments afterwards as well. I want to make sure that we get the audience quickly up to speed on what we're really talking about here, and the principles that you outlined that I spoke about a moment ago really help. And your book cites 12 dimensions of inclusivity that all leaders should consider when they're engineering new tools and services. What would you say we don't have to go over all 12, but what would you say of those 12 dimensions companies tend to be pretty good at solving for, and which ones are still widely under-considered and in need of much more attention?
It's a great question. I think that What I'd say is the focus on intersectionality is the most important, right? So I think that sometimes companies or teams try to rank the different dimensions. So things like race, gender, age, ability, socioeconomic status, geography, right? These are all things that are going to affect the consumers or the users that we're creating for. But there's no one user who has one dimension that makes them who they are, right? We all are multifaceted. So it's important to think, I think, holistically about how these dimensions intersect, right? So intersectionality is a key thing that we talk about a lot at Google. The term was coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who talked about how intersecting identities, specifically race and gender, when she first kind of brought this onto the scene. But we really want to help think about how intersecting identities affect how users move through the world and how they interact with products. So I try to encourage teams as much as possible to think about multiple dimensions and how those intersect.
Got it. Well, maybe we could dig into that a little bit further then. Assuming that a product team working on a new product is in fact taking that more intersectional view of its users. How might that apply in practice? What are when you're working with teams at Google to make sure that they're properly considering inclusivity in their work? How do you how are you identifying the problem areas, and how do you talk to your colleagues about improving there?
Yeah, so what we've found is that product inclusion should be an end-to-end system. So it shouldn't just be a point in time. And so it's really important to highlight kind of the key points where you need to bring that inclusive lens, right? So 4 points that I would suggest are ideation, user research and design, user testing, and marketing, because it kind of cascades throughout the end-to-end process. The next step is to say, who do we need to bring into the room to kind of help co-create and collaborate? And so we've created a group called Inclusion Champions, who are Googlers from historically underrepresented backgrounds, who help us test our products, who give feedback, do focus groups, et cetera. And the reason for that is because you can't really understand what the needs are of users without asking them directly, right? And having them come with their lived experience and their backgrounds and sharing that and having that help kind of shape the trajectory of product design. You mentioned empathy in the opening, and I think that that's key, right? Humility and empathy are key. And being okay with saying, we all come from our own kind of backgrounds, walks of life, have our own bias. And so we need to name that and make sure that we're asking who else and bringing more people and more perspectives into the fold. In terms of intersectionality, an example I use with product teams a ton is that I'm a Black woman who's also left-handed. And it's not like I'm Black on Monday, left-handed on Tuesday, and a woman on Wednesday, right? I'm all of those things all of the time. And so it's going to affect how I utilize products. And so if I'm, using scissors, obviously being left-handed is the most important thing. Hopefully the other two don't come into play. But if I'm, let's say, taking a picture with my phone, or I'm trying to unlock my phone, right, being Black and woman could intersect. And so that's how we try to help teams think about intersectionality. It's more about just seeing the kind of holistic perspective or the holistic identity of a user.
This idea of inclusion champions that you mentioned is really interesting to me. Could you talk more about what their work involves? Are they embedded with different product teams, and what kinds of issues do they tend to turn up in the process?
Yeah, so we realized we wanted to have as many kind of underrepresented perspectives as possible in the product design process. So we created this group of several thousand Googlers. And what they do is they work directly with product teams at those kind of critical inflection points I mentioned, right? So ideation, user research, user design, testing, and marketing. So specifically for testing, an example would be the work that we've done with the Google Assistant. Before it launched, we wanted to make sure that it was as inclusive as possible, and it was really showing up and being helpful for all of our users in the moments that matter most. Because we're building for the world, we want to make sure that as many perspectives are there as possible. And so we did what we call adversarial testing with our inclusion champions. And what an adversarial testing means is essentially we try to suss out anything that we wouldn't want the assistant to say, right, that may be alienating or have bias, but we also want to proactively add positive things, right? Cultural moments, answers to questions, right? If someone asks, tell me a fact about Pride or do Black Lives Matter, right? Making sure that it also has that cultural competency and context. And so what the inclusion champions did was they came with their own backgrounds and experiences and said, here's what we wouldn't want it to say, and here's what we would want it to say. And they worked in tandem with a very cross-functional team, across Google to make sure that we could proactively kind of remove those things that may be kind of non-inclusive before the product launched.
The work sounds kind of similar. I'm seeing parallels to like security researchers going through threat modeling. Like, what are all the ways that this could go wrong? It's essentially like forcing oneself to consider the worst case scenarios alongside whatever, of course, the product itself is attempting to do for the user. Do you buy that analogy? Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, I think it's a balance, right? I think, yes, of course, we want to make sure that the product is not unintentionally non-inclusive. But I think the other really big part of it is that when you build for underrepresented groups, it benefits everyone, right? So, which is known as the curbed cut effect. So in the 70s, when they started with sidewalks, right, they created that cut in the sidewalk, which was originally made for people with wheelchairs. But if you think about who uses that now, right, parents with strollers, people with shopping carts, skateboards, suitcases, et cetera, we all use that. And so I think that that's a really strong example of saying it's not just about minimizing risk, it's also about maximizing impact and opportunity for everyone.
This topic is near and dear to my heart, in part because my background is in product. That's what I led the product team at Quartz before my current role, and I'm proud of our record in particular on designing products accessibly and following web accessibility standards as much as possible. It strikes me that there's been a lot of work when it comes to accessibility for users with vision and hearing impairments using the web, to the point where there is a set of rules and standards that if you can follow and then check your website to make sure you're adhering to. That helps a lot for our teams trying to do our best by our users. That's not the case, though, for a lot of other types of bias or exclusion that would creep into new technologies. Would you say that there's a need for more sort of like standardization as there's been in web accessibility, or is that a naive idea?
No, I definitely think that's needed, and it's something that we're very cognizant of and working towards, right? So I think that when you have kind of common language and infrastructure, right, and resources for people to understand, this is why this is important and this is how you put it into practice, that's how people start to embed it into their system, right? I like to think of product inclusion as something that's embedded into those kind of key process points, but in order to do that, as you said, there have to be kind of key principles or key kind of standards that all teams can use. And so that's definitely a huge focus for us.
I'm curious, Google has the benefit of having you and others dedicated to trying to ensure inclusivity in products. But for smaller companies, I wonder what you would advise that change about their practices to ensure the same kind of rigor is embedded in the product development process, presuming that there isn't going to be someone wholly dedicated to product inclusion.
Totally. I think that there are a few things that a company of any size can do. I think the first one is to say, how do we get more perspectives than kind of the typical perspectives to the table? It could be something as simple as if the product team is having a sprint, inviting people from outside the team to join, right? It may be customers, it may be the marketing team, it may be HR, right? Trying to have a diversity of perspectives at the table is really important. The second thing I think that you can do is to think through how you do research, right? I think most companies of any size do some sort of research, whether it's surveys, whether it's focus groups, whether it's going out and just talking to people on the street, right? So then being really pointed about making sure that you're getting perspectives of those who have been historically underrepresented or those who have historically been at the margins, right? So an example of that would be if you're doing surveys, maybe do an online survey way with a group that can help you directly contact people from underrepresented groups, right? But I think it's really important that you are intentional about saying who else do we need to bring into the fold? Because I think a lot of times groups just move forward kind of with a plan, and they kind of bring these perspectives in at the end of the process. And really the goal is to bring it in as early as possible and have it cascade throughout. So I really think at the ideation phase and at that research phase, those are places where you can just say, we're going to make sure that we do a survey in rural areas if we always do them in cities. We're going to test out in Spanish because we always test out in English. It's small things that kind of compound that lead to really big results, I think.
That makes sense. My sense is over the last decade, a few of the more trendy developments in product development may be doing a disservice to inclusion in the products that get developed that way. I'm thinking of adoption of agile development practices, a focus on shipping minimal viable products, slogans like "move fast and break things" that a rival of yours once coined. That we're essentially, I think as product development is concerned, the core idea is get the thing out there as fast as possible and start getting feedback from your users and see, and iterate from there. But I do wonder if that sometimes is shorthand for skip some of the really core important ideas we're talking about here, like the thing can't be read by somebody who's blind, or the voice assistant has not been tested for whether its responses are culturally sensitive, and those are probably products that shouldn't be out there in the wild, and it isn't excusable to be failing on, even if it is a beta or so forth. How do you, the short version of this question, I guess, is just how do you advise product teams that want to be agile, move quickly, get real life feedback, but also presumably want to avoid those kinds of mistakes?
Yeah, so I think that there's a kind of mindset or perspective shift that has to happen, right? Where building with inclusion in mind doesn't necessarily mean it takes longer. It's about thinking through what are the key points in your process where you need to bring in a more inclusive lens, right? So I think when teams are moving quickly, that's fine, but you want to make sure that when you're building for a certain kind of challenge that you found for users, you've talked to a diverse slate of users, right? So if you're building something and you're building the minimum viable product, have you only tested or asked one type of person, right? Who else can you ask? Who else can you bring in? The same thing with testing, right? Teams, when they're doing MVPs or if they're trying to ship quickly, they're still going to have some element of testing, right? Like it's not like you just build something and then ship it without making sure that it kind of minimally functions. So I think in that case, how do you make sure that you have different people? Maybe, you do a friends and family kind of testing and you test with older users, for example, right? Or you test with kids. Like I think that you just have to say, these are the kind of critical points in our process, and how are we going to make sure that we just have some different perspectives that we may have otherwise overlooked?
That makes sense. It's sort of a different way of viewing even what QA, quality assurance, is thought of as meaning. It's not just about whether it works or not, or maybe redefining what it works means. Works for whom?
Exactly.
Last question for you. I imagine, since given your role, that at places like Google, your work is really welcomed by your colleagues, or I hope so. But I'm sure at other companies, product leaders who agree, are nodding along to this conversation, agree with everything we're saying, we might nevertheless face some resistance inside their company from their boss, et cetera, for trying to put some of these principles into practice in their own product development process. So, any advice in that case for convincing the boss that it really matters?
Yeah, I think tying it back to what your company cares about is important, right? I think DEI historically has been framed only as kind of a moral case, but it is the right thing to do, and it makes sense for a business, right? You're trying to serve as many people as possible. You're trying to kind of fulfill needs for as many consumers or users as possible. And so try to figure out how you can balance kind of that opportunity with the human case. That would be my suggestion, right? When you're building a product, there are probably more and more circles of people that could benefit from it. So just be really pointed about having a few data points around how this is actually the right thing to do and it makes business sense.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Anna. This was really helpful. And another plug for your book. If anyone out there was interest is piqued by this, there's a lot more that Annie goes into in the book, and I'd encourage everyone to check it out. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Have a great day.
That's all for this week's episode. We'll be back here next Tuesday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time with Melissa Wagner-Zorkin, the CEO of We Communications. Make sure to follow Quartz on LinkedIn. You'll get notified then whenever we go live. And in the meantime, for more of Quartz, you can subscribe to the Quartz Daily Brief, our morning daily newsletter for smart, busy people. I'll be back here next Tuesday. Hope you will too. Thanks for joining us.